T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another Seraphim Live webinar. Today we're here to talk about why your company needs a space strategy, and I'm pleased to welcome Brendan Russo. Brendan is a teaching fellow and a research associate at Harvard Business School. Hi Brendan.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much for having me.
No, thanks for being here. And he's focused on the economics of space activities, and he's one of the authors, of why your company needs a space strategy, but I'll let him tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And I'm also pleased to welcome back Maureen Haverty, who you all probably know is an investment principal at Seraphim, and she has a long history in the space industry, as she was previously COO at Apollo Fusion. Hi, Maureen.
Hi, Leah. Hi, Brendan.
So we'll run this in a Q&A style, but please feel free for anyone in the audience to post questions in the chat, and if they're relevant, we'll answer them as we go along. Otherwise, we'll pick them up at the end. But anyway, that's enough from me. You're here to hear from Brendan and Maureen. So Brendan, let's go straight to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to first realize the importance of companies having a space strategy?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having us and thanks for setting this up. This is fantastic. I have been interested in space for as long as I can remember. I was a telescope kid. I loved going to planetariums. Always had a deep fascination and love for space. And I thought I wanted to be a career astronomer and astrophysicist. But then I realized that when I was in college that something special was happening in the space industry. This is around the time that SpaceX was starting to have some success with the Falcon 9, and there was a buzz around a new era of space potentially opening up, driven by lower launch costs and all these new possibilities. So in addition to my work in astrophysics, I said, you know what, I want to get a degree in economics. I want to understand what's going on. Wrote my thesis on the evolution of funding space activities, and then spent some time working on Capitol Hill and trying to understand this whole big space enterprise, all the pieces that work together to make this thing work, and then how we can hopefully take a smart kind of forward-thinking posture to create a space industry and space environment that works best for everyone. And I hope someday, I still love astronomy and astrophysics deep in my heart. So at some point, I would love for this space revolution to produce a new generation of scientific instruments, things like the James Webb. So someday, and selfishly, I hope to be able to do that. But we're at such an interesting time in the space economy right now, a real launching point and turning point. So excited to be here and to talk with you about that.
Awesome. Thanks, Brendan. In your research, you credit the rise of the private space market following a shift in US policy. Can you tell everyone a little bit more about that and help explain that? And obviously, Maureen, please feel free to jump in if necessary.
Sure. So I think there's been so many changes in today's space landscape that it can be hard to point to one real factor, but I think there is one real catalyst, and that's a drop in launch costs. You know, people who know the history of the launch industry know that over time it became extremely consolidated, and all the firms got acquired, and it kind of narrowed down until there's really just one launch provider. It was a duopoly, and around that same time in 2011, the space shuttle retired. And so we were in this position where we had one launch provider to launch commercial satellites into orbit and government satellites into orbit, and no launch providers to send astronauts into orbit, except for the Soyuz and sending our astronauts over to Russia. So it was around this time that there was a change in policy. They said, you know what, NASA, we want to buy launch services instead of owning and operating the vehicle themselves. It was completely politically fraught, and it was a huge battle in Congress and the White House and even within NASA. But eventually they started the COTS program, Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, and then Commercial Crew and Commercial Resupply, and all these great programs that birthed companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, and then drop launch costs and open up all these exciting possibilities for all these other companies. So for me, that's the real catalyst. I'd be curious to hear Maureen's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think definitely the fall in launch costs for me, and the increasing frequency of launch has really changed the industry. Definitely, I think SpaceX is a huge part of that, but I also just wanted to give a little shout out to Spaceflight, who introduced effectively the concept of rideshare, which is they would buy a slot on a launch with SpaceX or with Soyuz or with PSLV by ISRO in India, and then would buddy you up with other satellites. And that allowed much smaller satellites, people doing one-off satellites, to really access affordable launch costs that were coming through the industry from SpaceX, from PSLV. And also they had this really handy thing where if you were going to miss your launch, you could just move to a different launch vehicle, which is great for startups who don't know exactly when they're going to launch, or they hope they'll make this first launch, but they might have to slip. So that increasing flexibility, I think, meant that people could try out new things. They could be more ambitious about when they were going to launch. And obviously, because things became cheaper, they didn't need to launch such an expensive satellite that would have to last 20 years. If you had to buy your own launch vehicle, you had to launch a GEO satellite, of course you want it to be absolutely guaranteed to work, because it could take years and hundreds of millions of dollars to launch another satellite. But if you can launch a satellite for 2 million, or even, $500K for a much smaller satellite, and you can also do it again in 6 months' time, a year's time, as fast as you can build a satellite, you can take a lot more risks in manufacturing your satellite, in designing your satellite, and that means that you can use much more innovative technologies. So the way that satellites are designed and the parts they can use are all much cheaper, higher performing than they've ever been. And I think that has been a big kickstart in the industry.
Great, thanks, Maureen. So you've explained how this really benefits the startup world, like the new commercial companies. But what about businesses? Like, how has this given them the ability to utilize this technology?
Well, I think first of all, actually, like in a lot of ways, I think that even larger space players are, who know how to build an expensive satellite, are taking advantage of this reduced cost to build cheaper satellites and to build constellations. So you have someone, for example, like Telesat, who was a geo operator, they can now move to a constellation model. They're planning to move to a constellation in LEO. So you've got, I think everyone is just taking advantage of better business opportunities. I think the new changes, the new commercialization of space have opened up new opportunities, particularly related to cloud services. So you've got two different approaches from really huge businesses. Amazon is planning, Kuiper essentially to support its AWS service. And then Microsoft Azure is aiming to really bring together all of the satellite operators and all the data they're producing and allow people to work with that easily, and has an Azure Space platform. They're just two examples of, I think, very large businesses that are taking different approaches to space. And then you've got some other companies that you wouldn't think of, like John Deere, who make tractors and are big in agriculture, and they are planning their own satellite constellation to support precision agriculture and connectivity for their tractors.
Yeah, that's. I just want to build on that. That's a great overview. I think the best description that I've seen about how to understand the revolution that's happening in orbit. Obviously, there's been a lot of attention on launch, but I think what I'm most interested in is what's going on in orbit. It's a description that Ashley Vance gives in his book, When the Heavens Went on Sale, which, if people watching this haven't read it, is fantastic. For so many reasons, Moore's Law never really made it to space. There was this hurdle of extremely expensive launch and just complicated kind of Byzantine procedures to be able to get, if you're a company, your satellite on the pad. There were these hurdles to innovation and having space systems move at the same speed as far as their development and even being in the same decade technologically wise as normal technologies here on Earth. So with the dropping launch costs and increasing availability, I think that's a great point, Maureen, that we don't talk about enough. We focus so much on costs and not the availability. Moore's Law is coming to space now. And for me, that has been such an exciting thing. And I think if you look at the companies that Seraphim has invested in, if you look at their portfolio companies, that you see that all across the board of companies that are using really interesting technologies, some of which aren't all that expensive, that can do great things on Earth and that are closing business cases for themselves and for companies down here on Earth.
Great, thanks, Brendan. Yeah, completely right. We see space as becoming an essential source of value for business on Earth and end users. And Maureen touched on some of the sectors like agriculture, or for example, pharmaceuticals, consumer goods. It would be great if you could provide some specific examples of how these companies are creating value and what opportunities you might see in the future for other industries to utilize these as well.
Yeah, so lots of different companies, and I'll just touch on some in our portfolio just so, because I'm familiar with it. So what are the changes going on in insurance, and how are our portfolio companies enabling that? So for example, ICEYE, our portfolio company, with its SAR constellation, can provide insights for risk adjustment for insurance companies during flooding. So essentially, very quickly seeing, what buildings have flooded, what depth, blah, 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 how much should be paid out as a result. And there's a push, obviously, amongst insurance companies to do that much faster, do that cheaper. And ultimately, there's a hope that you can get towards things like parametric insurance, where you can have a flood happen in this area, you just get an automatic payout. You don't have to apply for payment. Then we've got another new portfolio called Delos, who is tackling the wildfire insurance market, and they're moving into they're an insurance company themselves, enabled by space data. They've improved risk models for wildfire. So obviously, anyone on the West Coast hugely familiar with wildfires and the impact they have. They take the latest data on newly developing phenomena in wildfires and use that to predict where is actually at risk from wildfires. And you can have some areas that are actually surprisingly, what's the opposite of risky? Surprisingly safe from wildfires, even though they're actually in an area that you might think of as being highly at risk. And therefore that means that they can offer wildfire insurance when other more traditional insurance providers have had to move out of the area. So that's one example of insurance companies, I think, and how they're changing. In terms of, pharmaceuticals, which you touched on there, because I think everyone's really surprised there's pharmaceutical involvement in space. Essentially, if you do things in microgravity environments, so in space where there's effective weightlessness, the different physical phenomena there mean that materials and tissues develop differently. And that means that you can have profound implications for drug formulation in space. So 2,000 experiments have been done on the International Space Station, a lot of them by major pharmaceutical companies. And all of that research can be taken back to Earth and used to make, for example, improve drug formulations, or you can grow organs in space, or we're on track to be able to grow organs in space. And that could be a potentially huge market really enabled by space.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think if we talk about the greatest source of near-term value that applies to most businesses, or at least most businesses that could be thinking about space, I try to break it up into two categories. One is data from space. So that's data that is generated from space that can only conceivably be captured from space at that scale and with that precision. And then data through space. So that is, bytes of information that comes from the Earth, goes through space, and then comes back down, or some combination of the two. I think that those two capabilities are in many ways unique to satellites. By putting a satellite in LEO or GEO or MEO, you have an ability to step back and capture a view of the world that allows you to transmit data at a much broader scale, and nowadays at rapid speeds, or capture a swath of the Earth that you normally wouldn't be able to do. Those are the business cases and applications for satellites that I'm most excited about. Is this something that you cannot do on Earth, or cannot do it economically, but you can do it in space? And the end result of that, I think the ideal that we're moving towards, as far as data from space and data through space, is a real-time accounting system of the planet. That's another Ashley Vance phrase. I'll quote him because I love his ability to turn a phrase. And then also essentially the internet contained in outer space, a completely connected world in which you are never out of range of high-speed internet. So when you combine those two, we're not there yet. I think there are companies that are doing fantastic work, and the pace at which we're moving towards the ability to do that is striking. But if you combine a complete situational awareness of the Earth's surface and the ability to rapidly transmit large quantities of information all the way around the world, I think there's no company, no country, no organization that wouldn't be affected by that, directly or indirectly. I mean, it's a profound change that I think we're going to get used to in the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, and just to touch on a couple of really concrete, because we're like, oh, it's amazing, we can know everything about the planet, and it is fabulous. So what are companies building products around? Basically, everyone will have seen the stuff on greenwashing. We've got ESG rated financial products. We've got ESG rated assets. How do we actually know they actually are sustainable? So you've got companies that are monitoring deforestation. The EU is really driving towards demonstrating that your supply chain is not causing deforestation. And no, it's not enough for you to just sign a document anymore and say it's not. You need to provide proof, and you could be liable if you're not providing decent proof. So satellites, which can very rapidly check, are you sourcing something from an area that's undergoing deforestation, or are you causing deforestation? There are products around that. There are products around, or being developed around, effectively tracking cattle, exactly where they are, and is that causing deforestation? Is your beef being sourced essentially from deforested areas of the Amazon? There are companies that are trying to demonstrate that carbon credits actually do what they say they're doing. So you actually are sequestering carbon, or you're not causing deforestation. And there's lots of different companies with lots of different approaches on that, trying to rate the carbon credits. They're just two examples that I think that are big areas of growth. And I think another area where space feeds into the models is in The EU is now going to require you to stress test your assets against climate change, and good data, good space data, in a not too dissimilar way from what Delos is doing, can help really determine whether your assets are going to be affected by climate change.
Yeah, I'll give a specific example that I think is totally in line with what Maureen is saying. And since I'm an American, I'll go to fast food. There was a huge article in the New York Times the other day about the fast food industry, and it outlined a few key metrics that I thought are central to what we're talking about now. 9% of the emissions that the fast food industry and the agricultural industry more generally generate are from their supply chain. It is the process of getting things to the table that creates the harm to the planet. And the agricultural industry creates a huge portion of our greenhouse gases in the world. I think it's the third largest contributor of greenhouse gases in the world. And we are falling behind. The article was about, we are falling behind in our goals for being net zero, or at least contributing less and less carbon dioxide. And also our ability to understand, for these companies to self-report, to understand where their problem points are and where they actually are on the map, was not very good at all. A lot of the cases, they didn't have the data that they needed to say that they're meeting those goals. There's just a complete lack of awareness of what they can do. And I think that satellites, and particularly some of the companies that Maureen was talking about, and companies like Spire and Planet and ICEYE, there's a lot of them out there, I think could be a great resource for helping companies really understand, okay, if we say we're going to, reduce our carbon footprint, if we say we're going to source things sustainably, we're not going to contribute to deforestation, any number of the questions that come up when you talk about supply chains. I think that if you're a large enough company with a global footprint, I think that satellites probably need to be part of the equation, or at least be something that you're thinking about as you work on getting those metrics and meeting those goals 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road.
Exactly. I think it makes perfect sense. Like, catching bad actors, making people accountable. So this all boils down to space-based data, and companies are getting hold of that.
Yeah. I want to tweak that real quick, just because I think often we frame it as a negative thing that, if you're doing the wrong thing, we're going to catch you, with these all-seeing satellites in the sky. I think that's part of it, but I also think it gives companies that are doing the right thing the opportunity to say, hey, look, we're serious about what we're trying to do. We're meeting these goals, and this is something that hopefully, the market will support. And the good news, as far as I see it, is that people like us who are excited about these technologies, it's getting to be an easier and easier sell. These capabilities are getting better. They're becoming more interconnected. They're able to process more data in space, and they're getting cheaper and more accessible too. So that's it's making our lives easier these days.
Yeah, totally agree. Great point. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the way the businesses are utilizing the data, in their decision-making processes, and how does this bring direct value other than on the reporting side? But don't know who, Brendan, or I don't mind, Maureen, or whoever.
Maureen, do you want to go? I feel like I've been talking.
Yeah. I think. This is a really hard one. I think there's definitely some areas where we expected there to be greater utilization of space data than there has been so far. And I think maybe there's an opportunity here. For example, I think we talk a lot about hedge funds. Hedge funds are definitely going to use this data. They're going to look at whether factories are operating at full capacity in China, and they're going to use this to make investing decisions. And intuitively, it makes a whole lot of sense. I don't need to send someone out scouting. I have immediate data. I can have the information within 3 hours of something happening somewhere, and I can use that to make a trade. And certainly that does not seem to be happening as much. Now, there's a good chance that, hedge funds are like, I'm not going to tell anyone I'm using this data. I'm going to use it to maintain an edge. But it doesn't seem to be as big a driver as we would have thought. And, why is that? I think our analysis seems to be is that space data is not as easy to use as it could be, and it's not as, it doesn't fit in with the other data streams that companies have access to and are using all the time. Most businesses are data enabled right now. Most, they're really using all data streams possible. So why aren't they using space data as much? And we think it's probably because it's just a little bit hard to use. There's certainly an argument that you need to be a geospatial scientist to use the data effectively, and you need to really be into using Esri. And if you don't know what Esri is, that's totally normal, because most people don't, and that's probably why space data is not being used. So I think any company that really takes the data and just makes it into a product data stream, I think is going to be a key unlock for a lot of these satellite constellations and for space data to be used a bit more.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think if you talk with people who are working on making those transforming satellite data into useful products, that is the key challenge for them now. The first phase of kind of the EO Earth observation revolution or launching point was getting these systems up in space, proving the concept that yes, in fact, you can generate this data. We had a great conversation with Kevin Wheel from Planet. He's the head of product at Planet, the guy who's in charge of making these data into useful platforms. He said the first challenge for Planet when he got there was, is this even possible? Creating the ability to re-image the planet at high resolution every day. He said that wasn't obvious, and they were able to do that. It's sort of a technological marvel that they could. And then he describes it as, okay, became dog catches car. We're able to do this. How do we build a business around this? They have this feeling, like you were saying, this intuitive sense that this can be useful, but it's a whole nother thing to make that something that customers, number one, can use and then start demanding. So I think that's the phase that we're in now. Is companies are working to package up that data into a platform that's useful for people. Since I work on economics, I have to throw an economic concept in there that we think is helpful when thinking about these issues. It's sort of an esoteric principle called the Le Chatelier principle. It can be broken down very simply, which is that long run demand for changes in inputs changes more than short-term demand, because companies, when they become aware of the lower costs and the greater usefulness, greater productivity increases in a specific input, will be able to change over time. They will change the behaviors and adapt it. So if something is more useful or lower cost over several cycles, they'll change it. So that's one reason why, if you're looking for economic reasons for hope, we believe that as the products get better, as they get cheaper, and as businesses not only become aware of them, but then start incorporating them in kind of meaningful, small step ways, I think that we'll see that maybe not snowball, but at least translate into a bigger foot in the door.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. If anyone wants to post any questions for either Maureen or Brendan, please post them in the chat and we can come to them in a bit. What I found really interesting, Brendan, is the potential of in-space manufacturing and resource utilization. How do you envision companies being able to use this as just something else to discuss other than the data side? Like, how can companies bring these products potentially to Earth and utilize these?
Sure. Well, I think in-space manufacturing is a big question mark. It's an exciting one, but I think it is a question mark. For a long time, there's been this sense that the different physical parameters, the microgravity environment in space, could be extremely valuable. And I mean, at some level, you've got to believe that it is. How often do we stumble across something on Earth that is a space where physics operates differently? Some skeptics of manufacturing in orbit point to the history of the International Space Station and the previous attempts at commercial space stations, saying, hey, there were these predictions for huge amounts of demand, particularly from the pharmaceutical industry, and they never realized. So if you ask the skeptics, they'll say, people will always tell you that the big boom in space manufacturing is just 5 or 10 years away. So that's the skeptic's case. I think the optimist case is that we have never really made a full-throated attempt at assessing the viability of commercial applications for in-space manufacturing. If you look at the approach that people like Voyager are taking today, or people like Axiom, I think that it's clear that they are building their stations with a customer-first mindset. They are trying to create systems that are as useful as possible, and in some sense, their survival depends on it. So I think I am cautiously optimistic about the promise of in-space manufacturing. We call it a chicken and egg problem. You don't know what the killer app is for in-space manufacturing or in-space R&D until you have these commercial space stations. But to build and to sustain commercial space stations, you need some groundswell of demand. It seems like a lot of that initial push is coming from NASA and from foreign space agencies. But whether that translates into broader momentum and the commercial sector getting really excited about space stations, I think we'll have to wait and see. That's one of the exciting things about having a more market-based system in space. It's not entirely market-based. The government still plays a huge role, but we're shifting to having private priorities be more represented in the space industry. Sometimes you don't know what's going to pop out of the machine. That's the beautiful thing about competition and a free market approach. Weird things can happen, and they can be beautifully surprising. So I'm cautiously optimistic. We'll see what happens.
I think you're on mute, Leah.
Sorry, schoolboy error. Sorry. We had a few interesting questions come in, which is great. A question from Austin. He's from the Honda Accelerator Ventures in the Bay Area. He's wondering how a company could pay attention to the evolution of regulations, especially on the IP side and critical resource mining. I think that's probably quite an important question for a lot of people. Regulation. Who wants to pick that one up?
That's a good question. So I want to make sure I understand it. Following space regulation, and especially on the IP side and space resources.
So yeah, I think utilizing space resources and how that regulation may affect that over time.
Yeah. As far as the details of the IP side, I'll have to leave that to an expert on patents and intellectual property. Maureen, maybe you'll have a better sense of that. But I think the space resources question is really fascinating. We're for a long time the only binding treaty or sets of agreements was the Outer Space Treaty, which said that you can't claim anything in space, but you can go there. There was some ambiguity about, well, does that mean that you can really use the resources that are there, especially for commercial applications? But it wasn't resolved and didn't need to be resolved for a long time because no one had plans or the capability to go harvest space resources. Then the launch revolution happens, and all of a sudden, the idea of space mining doesn't seem totally crazy anymore. So I think the major catalyst was a legislation passed in 2015 in the United States, the commercial CSLCA, Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. If you're interested, look it up. But essentially, it instituted a finders keepers law for Americans and American businesses, saying if you are able to reach a space resource, be that an asteroid or even potentially the moon, you have the ability to use those resources for commercial purposes and profit off of that. So, and then that sparked, an international debate about, hey, is this where we all should be going, or is that a bridge too far? And then with the Artemis Accords now, there's some the signatories of the Artemis Accords essentially more or less agree to those principles that commercial utilization of space resources is allowed, and that you can keep what you do up there as long as you do it responsibly. Not everyone agrees on that, so I guess we'll really find out once people start doing it.
Thank you, Brendan. And I think Maureen's message there, yeah, Austin, if that's not quite right, then let us know and we'll try and answer that again. But I think thank you for covering that, Brendan. There's another interesting question from Ryan. I feel like this is probably a lot of people interested in, ensuring sustainable practices in space as well. So how can companies approach their strategies and making sure that they're acting sustainably?
Yeah, so Ryan, thanks for the question on the Dish Network fine. So I guess it's making a lot of headlines, in the non-specialist media as being the first fine ever. It's $150,000. I have to say I'm surprised by how low it is, given the fact that it's a geo slot. Why are we especially concerned about geo? There's not that many slots. They're big money earners. You have a specific slot. You have to stay in a 1 kilometer, radius of your box. So I guess I would have thought it would be a higher fine if it really is jeopardizing a geostationary slot. Now, obviously, they got out of the way, it's quite a bit out of the way, best efforts were made, etc., etc. So obviously, that's the thing. I guess no big company is really going to be affected by a $150,000 fine. No, I'm going to say totally, I come from the nuclear industry, and I think that we need to be careful as a space industry about balancing. Yes, we want to be sustainable, but we don't want to, lose sight of what the science is, and we don't want to lose sight of what the challenges are and overemphasize a risk from low sustainability or a risk from space debris that frightens us away from launching satellites or from doing anything in the industry. Why do I make the comparison to the nuclear industry is that I think that an overemphasis on nuclear waste, which isn't really driven by the science, and I'll have a chat with anyone or meet someone for coffee about that, isn't really driven by the science, but it has actually led to a lot of fear-mongering, has really delayed and actually completely halted deployment of nuclear internationally. So I think there are some lessons to be learned from that, and especially lessons to be learned from an industry that is extremely responsible in its waste management, but fear-mongering has led to it being painted in a different way and prevented rollout. So we do need to be really careful about how we talk about space debris, and no one wants to cause any harm. People are making efforts. It's extremely regulated already. The FCC is really careful on who it lets launch, and there are some arguments that it's too careful and it's too onerous on single CubeSats. They're going to decay naturally anyway. So that would be my thing. We need to be thoughtful, but not get ahead of ourselves and avoid scaring the non-informed public that leads to a backlash that could prevent us actually doing really useful things in space.
Yeah, I'll add 2 quick things. On the Dish Network side, what stood out to me more so than the $150,000 fine was, if I read it correctly, Dish will have to accept liability for any potential consequences that happen as a result of their failure to fully clear that orbit. So for me, $150,000 for a company like Dish is sort of a drop in the bucket. But that the fact that they have to accept that responsibility, I thought was huge, because one of the biggest challenges, if something does happen in space, is that you can point to an infinitely long series of events and you can say, someone else is responsible. That's what happened with the Iridium Cosmos incident, where a Russian satellite smashed into an American satellite. And they said, well, it actually wasn't our fault, and so no one was held liable. So that's on the Dish Network FCC side. And then one quick point on the sustainability side. Totally agree with everything you said, Maureen. One thing that I think is good for people to know that doesn't really get talked about enough is that with the rise of these mega constellations, there's been a growing kind of public concern about the threat that this will pose. And hey, there's more debris and there's more targets for debris. I think if you look at particularly SpaceX's track record and their approach to having a safe, active, connected constellation, their threshold for evasive maneuvers for a potential conjunction is 10 times more stringent than even NASA's. If there is a 1 in 100,000 chance that they're going to come within conjunction range, they move, and they have enough fuel on board for each one of those satellites to do 350 maneuvers over the course of its life. So that's the good news. The reason why I'm not fully sleeping well at night yet, maybe someday I will, is because the rate of satellites and the rate of debris, just natural debris, is still growing. And as we put more things in there, the measures that we're taking today, or at least the systems that we're putting up there today, aren't going to be as maneuverable enough or smart enough, or they're not going to be able to do what we need them to do in the future. Now, I'm not incredibly worried about it, because I think that we can prepare tomorrow's satellites to meet tomorrow's challenges. So I agree with Maureen. The worst thing that could happen would be we get so scared about it that it freezes investor confidence and freezes companies wanting to do things out. There's still lots that can be done and done responsibly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just think the worst thing for the industry would be is that if the average person on the street, when you meet them and you talk about space, you say you're in the space industry, and they start talking about orbital debris straight away. So we just need to be thoughtful about how we talk about this and how we manage it.
Yeah. I think letting the numbers drive the conversation and the engineering that goes into those mega constellations, I think that should be the focus.
And Maury, we could touch on a lot of our portfolio companies who are helping mitigate, against debris, Astroscale, for example. And I mean, there are.
Yeah. So
yeah, you go ahead.
We have several portfolio companies. So Astroscale is big in orbital servicing, helping dead. So key issue for the industry are dead satellites, aging satellites. In their geo slots. You don't want them stuck in their geo slots because you want to put another satellite in the geo slot, for one. Or it's expensive to launch a new satellite and you just like to extend its life. It's a perfectly good satellite. So Astroscale is working on this. D-Orbit actually now is working on this and has won some big contracts in Europe. And then obviously Leo Labs, who provides space situational awareness information to allow companies like SpaceX decide if they want to move out of the way. So there is a lot of activity going on here. Really want to reassure people that this is something that is being worked on.
Yeah, and just a quick addendum to that. I think the rate at which we have gone from having essentially the idea of a commercial company helping solve the space sustainability issue from it being a kind of a crazy idea where, no one's going to fund it. How is this something a company's going to do, to today where companies are not only funded well and doing incredible work, but companies like Leo Labs and Astroscale and D-Orbit are doing really great stuff. I mean, they're part of the reason why I don't think the space sustainability question feels as pressing or as desperate as it once did. I feel like we're at least on a good path.
Excellent, thank you. We're running out of time. It's been an awesome conversation, but I think we'll just one more question. I think that people may be interested in. If there's people who wanting to get a space strategy for their own company, what are the steps that they can take to do that, and are there any risks, or how can what can they do to start?
I'm guessing that's for me.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I think. I don't want to prescribe anything, because I think that companies know themselves and their businesses best, and it'll be ultimately up to them to decide, is this the right thing for me to do or not? I think my role is, to the extent I have a role in this, is just to help make people aware of not only what space is doing now, space capabilities, but also where it's going in the future. This is something that is growing fast, and increasingly penetrating the normal business world. And so it's something you should be aware of. I think if you're curious about space, and if you're curious about space, you're probably a large multinational company with a lot of resources and that does long-term strategic planning. I think actually a great place to start would be talking with the people who are making it happen. So Seraphim is a great place to talk to say, what should I know about space? What's really going on? They say, well, here's what's going on in our portfolio companies. This is kind of a small sampling of what's being built today and what space can do for you. Also, I think one positive change has been in the consulting world, people that are used to giving advice to these kinds of companies. I shouldn't say most. There are several large, well-established consulting firms, BCG, Deloitte. There's a bunch of them that are now offering like commercial space consulting. And I think just the awareness that they have and their familiarity with these companies is a great way to just kind of get your feet wet, to understand what the landscape is, and see, at least get the information to see whether you should jump in or not. So that's where I would start. And then also there's your space agencies. You know, space agencies love talking to companies. So don't be afraid to talk to NASA or ESA or the UK Space Agency or ISRO.
I'll just give a couple of like types of problems that companies might have, and not say like space is necessarily to solve them, but you might want to think about whether space could be useful. If you are a business that has lots of things that move around and they're in and out of connectivity all the time, there are space solutions being developed for that. You know, do you need to be in communication with things that move around? Do you need to just know where things that move around are? Like, space has a solution for you, whether that's existing solutions or something you want to do yourself in space. If you have a global supply chain that you want to monitor and you want to be able to check up on what someone's telling you, space is a solution for you. If you want very rapid insights on anything anywhere in the world, space has a solution for you. And if you're doing anything with the environment, monitoring emissions, finding like changes in environment locally, weather affects you, space has a solution for you.
Awesome, thank you. I think that's a great place to end our conversation. And if anyone listening has any more questions that they couldn't think of, please post them in the chat. This will be replayed as a recording on our LinkedIn page, and we can go back in and answer any questions like following the live. But thank you everyone for listening, and thanks to Brendan and Maureen for being part of the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.